Okay, we're going to move on and look at the history of journalism after the arrival of the printing press. And again, we're going to cover a whole lot of ground, so by no means am I trying to delve into the history of journalism with a fine-tooth comb or suggest that there's not a whole lot of territory that we're not covering here. But I'm just trying to sketch out a very broad, very rough illustration of how the field has developed over the years. So let me know if you have questions, and I hope all is going well in your online studies. So last time we talked about the history of journalism prior to the printing press. Today we're going to talk about the rise of professional journalism from the printing press to the digital age. So when we left off last time, we mentioned that Gutenberg first used the printing press around 1450 AD. And he printed about 200 copies at that time of the Gutenberg Bible and sold those at the Frankfurt Book Fair. And this was almost equivalent of 3 years' pay for the average clerk at that time. The cost of one of those 200 Bibles was approximately 3 years' pay of the average clerk. In 1493, Columbus returned from his discovery of the Americas, and he told of his journeys, and news spread through printed reproductions of his own initial letter. And so, because of the printing press, news about the New World spread much more rapidly than it ever could have prior to the printing press coming along. Jump ahead to 1620, then we have the first newspaper in English printed in Amsterdam, and it was called the Dutch Couranto. In 1624, we see advertising first appear in an English newspaper, which was published by Nathaniel Butter and Nicholas Bourne. And so we catch a glimpse of what would be the economic model that would drive journalism even into the present day. Of course, now with digital media turning the industry upside down, there's a lot of question about what the most effective business model will be in the future, and it may not be advertising. But again, in 1624, we start to catch a glimpse where we see newspapers being about more than just providing the news of events of the day. 1626. The newspaper called The Continuation of Our Weekly News in England printed a correction. And so we see here some first points of acknowledgement that readers were relying on these news sources for accurate information to base their own decisions on. In 1650, the oldest surviving daily newspaper was published in Germany. And in 1665, the Oxford Gazette, which was later called the London Gazette, was published in England as the first official journal of record. And it was the newspaper of the Crown. In 1690, we had the first American newspaper called Public Occurrences, and it was published for only one issue by Benjamin Harris, interestingly, because the king found it to be offensive and that some of the content was not to the liking of the British Crown. And so we see a real contrast here in some of the models in which journalism was being structured. One, the Oxford Gazette being the official journal and record, newspaper of record for the Crown, and then the other one, Public Occurrences, being an example of how newspapers could challenge those in power. And we've talked before about how journalism serves as the fourth estate, and one of its obligations and duties in the way it's structured today in democratic societies, America specifically, is to hold the powerful accountable. And so again, we see a tradition of that, a heritage of that, even as far back as 1690 in the American colonies. As we move on then in the period of 1765 to 1776, England and the colonies were in great conflict. We know that this was a time in which the sparks of revolution were growing hotter by the day. England was trying to impose taxes and laws like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts to try to stop the spread of revolutionary ideas. And in response, the colonists famously participated in the Boston Tea Party. Thomas Paine wrote his essay Common Sense, encouraging colonists to take up the cause against the crown and in favor of revolution. In 1777, looking back across the pond in France, we see the first daily newspaper arrive on the scene. And then in 1783, America's first daily newspaper, the Pennsylvania Evening Post, came along. It was published by a man by the name of Benjamin Town. In 1789, the French Revolution begins, in part because of a false report that 30,000 royalist troops of the French crown had begun to slaughter citizens in a section of Paris. Now, the development of journalism was revolutionary not just for democratic societies, but also for a number of groups that were previously marginalized, and this new wave of journalism and the spread of information brought rise to new opportunities for other voices to be added to social conversations. So in 1814, the steam engine was first used to print the Times of London, and production jumped with that technology from 250 sheets per hour to 1,100. In 1827, the first African-American newspaper, Freedom's Journal, was started. In 1828, we had a first Native American newspaper, which was called the Phoenix. In 1830, we had Godey's Lady Book, which was the most widely circulated magazine in the period before the Civil War. That was published in Philadelphia, and it was the first successful women's magazine. Then in the 1830s, we had another monumental period in the development of journalism, and this was the era of the penny press. In 1833, the New York Sun, which was known as the first penny paper, was launched by Benjamin Day, and this attracted a large working class readership. And so the approach of the penny press was to increase the number of copies that a newspaper printed, and thus increase its circulation. And by selling in greater volume, it could reduce the price that someone had to pay for the newspaper. So instead of about 6 cents for a copy of the newspaper that individuals used to have to pay, they could get it for 1 cent. So along with the New York Sun, we also had papers like the Public Ledger in Philadelphia, the Baltimore Sun, and again, mass production through the steam engine is what made this possible for the printing presses to pump out such a high volume of newspapers that they could then sell at a lower cost to a higher population of people, a greater overall circulation and readership. And so papers moved from covering elite news topics like commerce and trade and high politics and that sort of thing to more common populist topics like crime, tragedy, adventure, gossip, human interest, right? Things that appealed to just the everyday man and woman that would be buying this much cheaper newspaper, of newspaper that they could afford to read on a regular basis. In 1841, Horace Greeley started the New York Tribune, and higher circulations meant that they were much more lucrative for advertising. Advertisers were attracted to being able to reach a much wider audience with information about their products or services. And so publishers were no longer as dependent upon their partisan patrons, and they were able to become much more populist in their rhetoric than they had been in the past. However, ironically, the immense profitability of these papers actually ended up pushing owners into that very elite class, and eventually the penny press started to tone down some of its anti-establishment content. But in the late 19th century, we saw the rise of what was known as yellow journalism and the newspaper wars between Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. Pulitzer was the owner of the St. Louis Dispatch. He purchased the New York World in 1883, and he began filling it with a form of content that echoes much of the stuff that we see in today's news organizations. There was sensationalism, there was crusading and progressive politics, and there was a number of attention-getting campaigns and aggressive reporting as well. And William Randolph Hearst, a former reporter for the World, purchased the New York Morning Journal in 1895. So from this point on, Hearst and Pulitzer really fought bitterly to be known as the top newspaper publisher in New York and for all intents and purposes at the time in the country. Hearst hired away many of Pulitzer's journalists, including a cartoonist that drew the cartoon called The Yellow Kid, and that's where we get the name yellow journalism from. But sensationalism was the name of the game, and Hearst and Pulitzer would try to outdo one another to sensationalize topics like the atrocities committed by the Spanish in Cuba, and this helped ultimately, in many ways, lead America into the Spanish-American War. Accuracy didn't always take the front seat in yellow journalism, particularly for Hearst. He was known to be pretty sneaky, pretty willing to stretch the truth a bit in the name of attracting an audience to his newspaper. But circulations during this time would occasionally exceed 1 million copies. So that's really an amazing explosion of circulation growth when you think that prior to 1814 and the arrival of the steam engine in the printing press, circulations were as low as 250 newspapers being distributed. So it's really kind of mind-blowing to think about the growth in circulation over that period. So moving into the 20th century, then we see journalism really start to take its place on the front lines of covering news to and presenting it to a mass audience, a wide circulation. December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor was announced as, quote, breaking news. It interrupted a football game that was being broadcast over the CBS radio station. So we see broadcast journalism really finding a place as a news source at this time. And we move forward to November 22nd, 1963. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, and an estimated 68% of all Americans learned this news within 30 minutes of the event occurring. There was nonstop coverage. And again, if we think about comparing this to the spread of news in the 1800s, 150 years prior, right? And how quickly news was distributed now in the second half of the 20th century. It's really just amazing how quickly and how much news and the business of journalism, the spread of news information grew during this time. In 1971, the New York Times, later joined by the Washington Post and the Boston Globe, received the Pentagon Papers, and these were classified documents that the government tried to prevent publication of the information. These classified documents were leaked to newspapers around the country, and the government didn't want some of the classified information in there to be released to the public. In large part because it didn't look good for the government. It showed that they knew a lot more about what was going on in Vietnam than they were letting on. They knew that it was an unwinnable war. They had lied to the American public about their reasons for going to war, and they had been involved in Vietnamese internal affairs for many years prior to the actual Vietnam War occurring. So this was actually heralded as a landmark Supreme Court case because it ruled in favor of the press having a right and responsibility to provide information out there to the public in holding the government accountable, even when perhaps that information might be classified. In 1973, two young reporters at the Washington Post by the names of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein led the charge in investigating the Watergate break-ins. This series of reporting eventually unraveled a corrupt administration in the Nixon White House, and eventually President Richard Nixon resigned as a result of his connection to those crimes. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan was shot and seriously wounded. Video of the assassination attempt was aired by 3 major networks within 30 minutes. So not only did America learn about this information in such a short period of time as we saw with the JFK assassination, but there was actual video of the event that was distributed to a wide audience in America within a matter of 30 minutes. In 1986, the NASA Space Shuttle Challenger exploded after launch, and 48% of 9-year-olds to 13-year-olds, according to a New York Times poll, watched this launch on live TV at school. And so this was a moment of tremendous national mourning being shared by this form of mass communication, specifically television, at that time. As we move into the digital age, some landmark moments stand out. In 1998, blogger Matt Drudge broke the news that President Bill Clinton was having an affair with Monica Lewinsky. Obviously, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this story. But the fact that it was broken by an online journalist was really a turning point or a landmark moment in the field. September 11, 2001, television covered the immediate aftermath of the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and U.S. Airlines Flight 93. Likewise, demonstrating the power of digital media in 2002, Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott was speaking at the 100th birthday party of Senator Strom Thurmond, and during his speech he made an offensive remark regarding Thurmond's 1948 Dixiecrat run for president, which was grounded on segregationist politics. He said that the country would have been better off if Thurmond would have won that election. And one ABC reporter by the name of Ed O'Keefe ran it on the web, where it then exploded to the point of mainstream awareness. But there were actually many journalists of traditional platforms there at the birthday party for Thurmond, but Ed O'Keefe was the only one that picked up on the news value of this story and ran it on the web. And so this was an interesting example, much like the Matt Drudge story, where content started on the web and then grew in popularity to a point where it reached a mainstream audience on the traditional news platforms. In 2005, the Huffington Post launched, and it has been in many ways a flagship for digital journalism, certainly one of the earlier examples of digital native journalism. In 2010, the longtime news magazine Newsweek merged with the online publication The Daily Beast. In 2011, the New York Times put a paywall in place, and this was a big moment because prior to this, at least on the whole, most major newspapers had not been charging their readers to access their content. But this was sort of a defining moment where the Times came out and said, we think that this product, this information that we're providing has value, and if readers want that, we're going to ask them to contribute through their finances to help us pay for the content that we're putting out here. In 2012, Newsweek announced that it would actually be stop publishing its print edition and went online only with the Daily Beast. And of course, this was a major moment. Again, Newsweek being a long time, well-established news magazine, to have it go online only was a major moment in the development of the field. So that's the history of journalism in a very quick overview, both from part one and part two. Now, we covered obviously a lot of ground, all the way from humans arriving on the scene of the planet as Homo sapiens, on up until the present day. So, certainly by no means did we cover everything that there is to know about the history of journalism, far from it, but hopefully we hit some highlights there and gave you a better understanding of sort of how the field has progressed over time.